The day I got called into HR, I had just finished a compliance review that found 3 reporting errors no one else had caught in 2 years. That's what I remember most. Not the shock, not the embarrassment of being walked out. I remember thinking, I literally just saved this company from an SEC footnote disclosure issue, and someone is handing me a manila envelope. My manager wasn't there. His assistant was. She looked at the wall behind me the entire time she spoke. The company is restructuring its legal and compliance function, she said. Your position has been eliminated. I asked if this was performance-related. She said no. I asked if there was an appeal process. She said the decision had already been reviewed at the VP level. I nodded. I signed where they told me to sign. I was given a box, a check for $8,000, 4 weeks of severance, and an escort to the elevator by a security guard I had eaten lunch with dozens of times. He didn't make eye contact either. The revolving door pushed me out onto Fifth Avenue, and the October air hit me flat across the face. I stood there for a moment with my box. My stapler was in it, a plant I had kept alive for 3 years, a framed photo of my sister's kids, a copy of the Dodd-Frank compliance manual I had annotated myself. I thought, okay. Ashford Group, a mid-sized financial services company, the kind that's big enough to have a real legal department but small enough that everyone knows who parks and who spot. I had come up through internal audit, moved laterally into IP licensing compliance, then built what became the firm's structured products review function almost from scratch. I cared about that work in a way that probably looked strange from the outside. Compliance isn't glamorous. You spend a lot of time being the person in the room who says, actually, we can't do that. Nobody buys you a cake for it. But I was good at it, and I knew it. What I didn't know, what I only found out 2 months later through a former colleague who felt guilty enough to call, was that the restructuring had been engineered by the incoming chief operations officer. His name was Russell. He had come from a consulting firm, believed compliance was a cost center that should be outsourced, and had spent his first 90 days at Ashford quietly repositioning people who disagreed with that view. I had disagreed with it once, in a department head meeting where I probably wasn't careful enough about how I said it. That was the whole story. 6 years eliminated in a sentence. I cried exactly once, the night after, and then I didn't again. I had a mortgage on a 1-bedroom in Hoboken. I had student loans. I had gone back from JD part-time while working full-time, which was the hardest 3 years of my life and something I was still paying for monthly. I had a sister who thought I was fine because I told her I was fine. $8,000 is not nothing. It is also not a runway. I filed for unemployment the next morning. That same week, I rewrote my resume, updated my LinkedIn quietly, and sent out 27 applications. I heard back from 4. 2 went nowhere. 1 was a step down I wasn't willing to take yet. 1 was a contract role at a boutique law firm that reviewed licensing agreements for biotech companies. I took it. The pay was lower. The commute was longer. The coffee machine was broken for 3 months and nobody fixed it. I did not complain about any of this. I put my head down and I learned everything I could about biotech IP compliance, pharmaceutical licensing structures, FDA regulatory submissions, and cross-border technology transfer agreements. I became fluent in a completely different language of contracts, and I did it faster than anyone expected, because when you have something to prove, the learning goes differently. The senior partner, a woman in her 60s who wore the same pearl earrings every day and had tried more IP litigation cases than anyone else in the office, told me after 8 months that I was the best contract hire they'd had in a decade. I asked if there was a path to permanent. She said not right now. I said okay, and I started looking again. What happened next took about 14 months. A lot of networking calls I had to force myself to make, and one very lucky introduction at a conference in Chicago. I landed at Meridian Capital Partners as their Director of Regulatory and IP Compliance. Meridian was a private equity firm that specialized in healthcare and life sciences acquisitions. They bought companies, fixed them, resold them. My job was to get into the legal and regulatory bones of every acquisition target and tell them exactly what they were actually buying. It was the most interesting work I had ever done. Due diligence at that level is archaeology. You are not reading the surface documents. You are reading the documents underneath the documents, the amendments buried in Exhibit C, the side letters that modify the side letters, the licensing agreements that encumber IP the company thinks it owns free and clear. I had a talent for finding things people had convinced themselves weren't there. My boss, the managing director who had hired me, knew this within the first 2 months. She gave me increasingly complex assignments. I did not miss a deadline. I did not need to be managed. I showed up knowing more about the target company than the bankers representing them had usually bothered to read. I was good at this job, and I knew it. The difference was now I was in a place where being good at the job was the entire point. It was 18 months into my time at Meridian when the assignment came. We were looking at a healthcare services company that had recently been put up for sale. The seller was a private equity group that had owned it for 5 years and was ready to exit. The deal was in the range of $240 million. My job was to lead IP due diligence, patents, licensing agreements, software ownership, regulatory submissions, anything with an IP dimension. My managing director sent me the target company's name on a Tuesday afternoon, Ashford Group. I read it twice. Then I picked up my phone and called her directly. I need to disclose something before I accept this assignment, I said. She asked what it was. I worked at Ashford for 6 years, I said. I was in their compliance department. I left, or was let go, about 2.5 years ago. Before I do anything on this deal, you need to know that, and you need to decide whether it's a problem. There was a pause. Does it affect your ability to be objective? She asked. I thought about that honestly. I thought about Russell. I thought about the security guard who didn't look at me. No, I said. It makes me more thorough. Another pause. Then, I'm noting this conversation in the file. You're on the engagement. But if at any point you feel it's affecting your judgment, you come to me. Understood. And I want full written disclosure in your engagement letter. Already planning on it. I want to be clear about something. I did not take that assignment to settle a score. I am not built that way, and more practically, in my world, that kind of motive will destroy a career faster than anything else. What I did was disclose my history, document it properly, and do my job. What my job required in this case was telling the truth about what I found. And what I found was significant. Ashford had grown since I left. They had acquired 2 smaller companies during that period and had expanded into health data analytics, a newer division that was generating a lot of their current revenue and almost all of their growth story. The sale was being pitched on the strength of that division. The valuation was built substantially on its projected revenue. I spent 3 weeks inside their documents. What I found in the 4th week was that the core software platform underlying the analytics division had been developed partly by an outside vendor under a licensing agreement. That licensing agreement had been renewed once and then allowed to lapse. Not deliberately, I think, but through the kind of administrative carelessness that happens when a company grows faster than its legal infrastructure. There was a dispute clause in the original agreement that, once the license lapsed, gave the vendor the right to renegotiate terms or demand cessation of use. The vendor had not yet asserted that right. But the exposure was real and undisclosed. I also found 3 instances where regulatory submissions to CMS had used data methodology that was no longer compliant with updated 2023 guidance. Not fraud, I want to be clear about that, but non-compliant in a way that would require remediation and could affect reimbursement rates. None of this was in the seller's disclosure documents. I wrote it all up, clearly, completely, without editorializing. I listed the findings. I documented the sources. I quantified the estimated remediation cost and the licensing exposure as a range. I sent the draft to my managing director. She read it and called me within the hour. This is thorough, she said, which in her vocabulary was high praise. It's accurate, I said. It's going to be a difficult conversation with the seller. That's above my pay grade, I said. My job was to find what was there. The meeting where we presented our due diligence findings to the seller's team happened on a Wednesday. I was not in that meeting. What I know is what my managing director told me afterward, and what I eventually pieced together from people on both sides. The seller's bankers pushed back hard on the licensing exposure finding. They characterized it as immaterial. Our team disagreed. There was a back and forth that went on for several weeks and eventually involved outside counsel on both sides. What I know for certain is that the deal price was renegotiated. The final number was $206 million, $34 million less than the original valuation. I know because my managing director told me. She also told me, with a small smile, that the seller's side had been vocally unhappy with the precision of our IP review. I did not ask whether Russell was still at the company. I didn't want to know. About 6 weeks after the deal closed, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was a woman who introduced herself as the head of the integration team that had been brought in post-acquisition. She said she had read my due diligence report carefully. She said it was one of the most precise documents she had encountered in 20 years of M&A work. She said they were building out the regulatory function at the newly acquired entity and asked if I would be open to a conversation. I said I was always open to a conversation. We met for coffee near Grand Central. She told me what the role would look like. She told me what the compensation would look like. I thanked her and said I needed to think about it. I called my sister that night. She is the person I call when I need to say something out loud to understand what I actually think. So, they want you back at the place that fired you, she said. Technically, it's been acquired, so it's a different entity. You know what I mean. I know what you mean. What do you mean? What do you want to do? I sat with that for a moment. I think, I said slowly, that I want to go back, not because of what happened before, because it's a genuinely interesting problem and I'm the best person for it. And because I stopped. Because what? My sister said. Because I've spent 2.5 years becoming exactly the person who should walk into that building. And I'd like to go back in through the front door. I did not take the role in the end. I want to be honest about that, because the cleaner ending would be that I walked in and took over and everything came full circle. But the terms weren't right for where I was in my career. And I had learned, in the years between that October morning on Fifth Avenue and this moment, to make decisions based on what was actually in front of me rather than the story I wanted to be telling. What I did instead was negotiate a consulting agreement. I would lead the regulatory remediation workstream for 12 months, the exact issues I had identified in my due diligence report. I would not be an employee. I would not have a desk. I would come in when the work required it, and I would deliver what I said I would deliver. It was, practically speaking, the better structure for me at that point. The first day I went in for an on-site session, I walked into the lobby and gave my name at security. The guard looked at the system, printed a visitor badge, and handed it to me. Consequent, Meridian Capital Partners. I clipped it to my jacket and took the elevator up. In the conference room where they had set up the integration work group, there were about 12 people around the table. Some of them I recognized from my time there. Most I didn't. A few of the ones I recognized looked at me with an expression that took a moment to read. Not quite confusion, not quite recognition, something in between. The head of the newly appointed legal team introduced me. This is the consultant who led IP due diligence on the acquisition. She's going to be running the remediation process on the licensing and CMS compliance findings. One of the people across the table, a man I remembered from the general counsel's office, someone who had always been decent, looked at me for a long moment. "Have we met?" he said. I held his gaze. "I don't think so," I said, which was technically true in the context of this engagement. "But I know your documents very well." He nodded slowly and looked back down at his papers. The remediation work took 11 months. I renegotiated the vendor licensing agreement. It took 4 months and 2 rounds of outside counsel involvement, but we reached terms that were favorable to the newly acquired entity and resolved the exposure cleanly. The vendor, for what it's worth, had not been trying to create leverage. They had simply noticed the lapse and waited to see what would happen. Once we came to the table with good faith and a fair offer, the conversation moved quickly. The CMS compliance issues took longer because they required resubmitting updated methodology documentation and working through the agency's review process, which runs on its own timeline regardless of how well prepared you are. But we did it correctly and completely. At month 11, I delivered my final report. The remediation was complete. The risks I had identified were resolved. The company was in better regulatory shape than it had been when Ashford owned it. I did not make a speech. I handed in the report, answered questions for 40 minutes, shook hands around the table, and collected my things. On the way out, I passed by the floor where I had worked for 6 years. I didn't stop. I didn't look for anything in particular. I just noticed it as I walked past. The same layout, different furniture, different faces at the desks. I pressed the elevator button and waited. When the doors opened, the person stepping out was a woman I recognized immediately. She had been one of Russell's direct reports, one of the people who had stayed quiet during the restructuring when staying quiet meant something. She looked at me. A long look. "Oh," she said. "Hi," I said. There was a pause. She opened her mouth slightly, then closed it. "Are you," she started. "Just wrapping up some consulting work," I said pleasantly. "Take care." I stepped into the elevator. The doors closed. I looked at my own reflection in the polished metal of the doors and thought about how many mornings I had taken that same elevator up, back when I worked there, back when I thought that job was the place I was building toward. The doors opened at the lobby. I walked out through the revolving door onto Fifth Avenue. The air was cold. November this time, not October. I stood there for a moment. No box, no stapler, no plant. Just my bag and my coat and the case files, saved in the cloud. I thought about what my sister had said. You've spent 2.5 years becoming exactly the person who should walk into that building. I had done that. I had walked in. I had done the work. The next chapter didn't start in that building. It started wherever I walked to next. I buttoned my coat and headed toward the subway. I've thought a lot about what actually happened in that story. Not the deal. Not the 34 million, the smaller thing underneath all of it. When I got that manila envelope and walked out onto Fifth Avenue with a box and a stapler and $8,000, I made a decision I didn't fully understand at the time. I decided not to become bitter about it. That sounds simple. It wasn't. Bitterness is genuinely the easier choice. It gives you something to organize your energy around, a reason to keep moving that doesn't require you to be honest with yourself. I had every reason to be bitter. I had been good at my job. I had been let go because someone with more power than judgment wanted to reshape a department, and I was inconvenient. But here's what I've come to understand. The people who treated me that way didn't take anything from me that I couldn't rebuild. They took a job title, a salary, a parking spot. They didn't take what I actually knew, or what I was capable of learning next, or the integrity that I brought to work every single day, whether or not anyone was watching. Those things went with me at the revolving door. And that's the part that matters. Because 2 years later, when I sat in that conference room with their documents in front of me, the only thing that produced a useful result was exactly that, the knowledge I had kept building and the integrity that made it impossible for me to write anything other than what was true. I did not find those licensing issues because I was looking for revenge. I found them because I was looking carefully, the way I always look, and they were there. The cause of what happened to the deal wasn't my history with the company. It was their own carelessness, sitting undisclosed in Exhibit C of an agreement nobody had bothered to check. That's the thing about actions. They don't disappear. They accumulate. Russell made decisions during that restructuring that felt, I'm sure, like smart business. And maybe in the short term they were, but the culture of carelessness he installed, the attitude that compliance was a cost center, that details were someone else's problem, that culture produced the exact conditions I found 2 years later. He didn't intend to create an undisclosed licensing exposure. He just created an environment where that kind of thing could quietly grow, unnoticed, until someone like me showed up and read closely. I think about my sister's question a lot. What do you want to do? Not what should you do, not what would look good, not what would feel satisfying. What do you actually want? I wanted to be the person who could walk back into that building on my own terms and do excellent work. Not to prove something to Russell, who probably doesn't think about me at all, to prove something to myself, to close the loop on a chapter that had ended in a way that didn't reflect who I actually was. That's what I did. And when I walked out of that lobby for the last time, badge in hand, case files in the cloud, I felt something that wasn't triumph exactly. It was quieter than that, more like alignment, the feeling of having acted consistently with what I believed across 2.5 years of inconvenient work and unglamorous grinding, and having it compound into something real. The $8,000 ran out. The knowledge didn't.